He kissed her like she was coming home. That was the first thing Naomi Carter Moretti saw when she pushed open the front door of her own house. The house she had filled with flowers and soft rugs, and the quiet hope that a violent man could still choose a different life. Her husband's hands were on another woman's face. Gentle, careful. The way he had never once touched Naomi when he thought no one was watching. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the ultrasound photo she'd been holding for 3 hours, waiting to show him. She just stood in the doorway of her own life and watched the man she had loved rebuild himself for someone else. If that were you standing in that doorway, clutching the proof of the family you thought you were building, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you've never watched one of our stories before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we release stories just like this every single week. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if something in the next few minutes hits close to home, hit that like button. It costs nothing, and it means everything to a small channel trying to reach people who still believe in real storytelling. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the night that ended everything. Naomi had been running late all day, and that was actually unusual for her. She was the kind of woman who showed up 10 minutes early to everything. Doctor's appointments, dinner reservations, her own wedding. Alessio used to tease her about it. "You'd be early to your own funeral, Bella." She had laughed then. She didn't know yet that punctuality could save a life or shatter one, depending entirely on what you walked in on. The appointment had been at 3 in the afternoon, and her OB/GYN's office was the kind of place that smelled like lavender and false calm, with watercolor prints on the walls and magazines that were always 6 months old. Dr. Reeves was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair who spoke to Naomi like she was a person, not a patient, which was rarer than it should have been. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Reeves had said, tilting the monitor so Naomi could see. "Strong heartbeat, right on track." Naomi had pressed her fingers to her lips without meaning to. On the screen, something impossibly small had been moving. A flicker, a rhythm, a person who didn't exist yet but already had a heartbeat, already had fingers the size of apple seeds, already had a father with gray eyes who was going to have to learn, she had decided this firmly, how to leave the office before midnight. Dr. Reeves had printed the photo without being asked. She'd slid it across the table with a small smile that suggested she'd seen this exact expression on 1,000 women's faces. The one that said, "I didn't know I could want something this much." Naomi had sat in her car for 40 minutes before she could drive. She'd held the photo against her chest and thought about Alessio. Not Alessio the way other people knew him. Not the man who made grown men lower their eyes when he walked into a room. Not the man whose name traveled through the criminal architecture of the city like a current through water. She thought about the Alessio who sometimes made her coffee wrong on purpose just so she'd fuss at him. The one who kept a photograph of his dead mother in the inside pocket of every jacket he owned. The one who had proposed to her with a ring that was too big and eyes that were too honest, and a voice that, for the first and only time she had ever witnessed it, shook. "I'm not a good man," he had said that night, "but I want to be. For you, I think I might actually be able to." She had believed him. She still believed him, sitting in that car, looking at a black and white image of the child who would carry both their names forward into a future that Naomi had started to imagine with something that felt dangerously close to peace. She drove home in the early dark of autumn, with the heat on and the radio off, and the photo tucked carefully in the inside pocket of her coat, right over her heart. The house was lit from inside when she turned into the driveway. That was normal. Alessio kept the lights on. He always had, even in rooms he wasn't using. He told her once that it was a habit from childhood, from a time in his life he never described in detail, and she'd learned not to push. Dark rooms make people disappear, was all he'd ever said about it. She had filed that away with the rest of the small, jagged truths she'd collected about him over 4 years of marriage. The ones that made her understand that the man she loved had been built out of damage and had spent a long time trying not to show it. She parked and sat there for a moment. She was going to go inside and find him, probably in the study or the kitchen, probably with his jacket still on, because he never quite managed to decompress before 9 o'clock. She was going to walk up to him, and she was going to take the photo out of her pocket, and she was going to watch his face change. She wanted to see that. She had been looking forward to it for 3 hours. She got out of the car. The front door wasn't fully latched. That was the first thing she noticed. The way it gave an inch when she touched it. the way cold air had been leaking into the foyer, which meant it had been like that for a while. Alessio was meticulous about locked doors. It was a professional habit that had become domestic reflex. He locked everything. Always. She pushed it open quietly, the way she did when she thought he might be on a call. The foyer was empty. The hallway light was on. From somewhere deeper in the house, the living room, she thought, or the space just off it, she could hear voices. Not raised, not arguing, soft. The kind of soft that carries more weight than shouting because it means something is being said that was never meant to be overheard. Naomi stood in her own foyer with her coat still buttoned and her hand still on the door. She told herself to call out, to say I'm home, to make enough noise that the moment would rearrange itself before she had to see it. She didn't. Instead, she walked toward the sound the way you walk toward something that you already know is going to break you, slowly, and with your heart trying to exit your body through your sternum, and with the very specific kind of dread that only exists when part of you already knows the answer to the question you haven't yet asked. She stopped at the edge of the hallway. Alessio was standing in the middle of the living room with his hands on a woman's face, both of them, cupped, the way you hold something you're terrified of dropping. The woman, tall, dark-haired, wearing a coat that still had the cold of outside on it, which meant she hadn't been there long, or maybe she had, and it just meant nothing, had her hands wrapped around his wrists, not pushing him away, holding him there, keeping him close. Vivian Greco. Naomi knew her name the way she knew the names of all the relevant people in Alessio's world, carefully and at a distance, and with the particular vigilance of a woman who understood that her husband's past was not entirely behind him. She had heard Vivian mentioned twice, once by Alessio's Lieutenant Marco, who had stopped mid-sentence when he realized Naomi was in the room. Once by Alessio himself, 3 years ago, in a context she hadn't fully understood and hadn't pressed. She understood now. Alessio was saying something. His voice was too low for Naomi to catch the words, but she could hear the texture of it, the apology woven into it, and also the tenderness, and also something that sounded uncomfortably like relief, like a man who had been holding something in for a long time and had finally set it down. Vivian said something back. She pulled one of his hands away from her face and pressed it briefly to her own cheek, and even from across the room, from the shadow of a hallway in her own house, Naomi could see the way Alessio's eyes closed for just a second, like it hurt, like letting go of something hurt. The photo in Naomi's pocket felt suddenly very heavy. She took one breath, then another. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that distantly, with some part of her brain that was still performing its basic functions. Her hands were completely still. She didn't understand that. She thought they should be shaking. She backed up. 1 step. 2. Back into the foyer. Back to the door she hadn't fully closed. She slipped out into the cold and she pulled it shut behind her. Gently, so neither of them would hear. And she stood on the front steps of the house that had her name on the mortgage and her handwriting on the kitchen calendar and her child growing somewhere behind the sternum, invisible and entirely trusting, and she breathed. In, out. The night was very quiet. Across the street, someone's porch light flickered. Naomi walked to her car, got in, and drove away. She didn't go to her sister's house. That was the first instinct. Maya, who lived 20 minutes north and who would have opened the door in her pajamas and sat Naomi down on the couch and said, "Okay, tell me everything," in the voice she'd been using since they were children. But Naomi couldn't say it out loud yet, couldn't arrange it into words. It was still just an image, his hands, her face, his eyes closing, and she needed it to stay that way for a little longer. Not yet a story, just a thing she had seen. She drove for a while without direction. The city moved around her the way it always did at that hour. Neon and headlights and people walking fast in coats, all of them carrying their own invisible freight. She stopped at a red light somewhere downtown and sat there through 2 cycles because she didn't notice it had changed. The car behind her eventually honked. She pressed the gas and kept going. She ended up at a diner on the east side, a place called Marcy's that she'd been to maybe twice before, that had green vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed before she was born. She sat in a corner booth and a tired-looking server named Deb brought her a mug without being asked and didn't comment on the fact that Naomi was still in her coat, still completely put together, still technically fine. Naomi wrapped both hands around the mug. She took the ultrasound photo out of her pocket and laid it on the table. She looked at it for a long time. The child in the image didn't know anything. Didn't know what his father's hands had been doing an hour ago. Didn't know that his mother was sitting in a diner on the east side trying to figure out what the rest of her life was supposed to look like now. He just was woke. Heartbeat and movement and the specific, relentless insistence of new life. Naomi pressed 2 fingers to the photo, not quite touching it, close. She thought about what Alessio had told her before their wedding. He'd been sitting on the edge of the bed in the hotel room where they'd spent the night before the ceremony, and she'd woken up to find him just sitting there in the dark, not sleeping, which was unusual even for him. "What are you doing?" she'd asked. "Memorizing this," he'd said, "the way things are right now, before they change." She'd thought it was sweet. She'd told him things were only going to get better. He'd looked at her with those gray eyes, the same eyes that were currently closed in what might have been grief or might have been something else entirely, and said, "I know, that's what scares me." She'd laughed. She wasn't laughing now. She sat in Marcy's diner until well past midnight. Deb refilled her coffee 3 times and never asked a single question, which was either professional courtesy or human intuition, and either way, Naomi was grateful for it. Around 1 in the morning, she started making a list on the back of a paper napkin. Not a dramatic list. Not a list of his failures or her grievances, just practical things, things she needed to think through. An orderly response to an orderly problem, because she had learned a long time ago that the only way to survive something was to make it small enough to look at. She wrote until she ran out of room. Then she folded the napkin, tucked it in her pocket next to the photo, and she drove to a hotel. She slept 3 hours. In the morning, she called Maya. She didn't explain. She said, "I need you to come help me." And Maya, who had known Naomi for 38 years and could read a phone call the way other people read a text, said, "I'm already in the car." They didn't speak much. Maya drove. Naomi navigated. They went to the house while Alessio was known to be out. He left before 7 on Thursdays, every Thursday, without variation, because he was the kind of man whose schedule was also a kind of armor, and they packed what mattered. Not everything. Not even most things. The things that were irreplaceably hers. The box of letters her mother had sent her before she died. The photograph from her college graduation. The small clay bowl Noah had painted at a fair before he was born, which didn't make sense as a sentence yet, but it was the only way she could think of him. Not as a concept, but as someone who had already been doing things, already leaving small evidence of himself on the world. She left the ring on the kitchen counter. She didn't plan that. She was standing at the sink filling a water bottle and she just took it off, set it down, looked at it. Then she picked up the box Maya was holding and she walked out of the house without turning around. By the time Alessio came home that evening, Naomi was already outside the city. By the time he found the ring, she imagined it was later that night because he wouldn't have gone into the kitchen until late. And the kitchen counter was the kind of surface you didn't look at carefully unless you were looking for something. She was somewhere he had no map to. She had prepared for this. Not the discovery, not the betrayal itself, but the aftermath. She had prepared quietly and carefully and over a longer period of time than she was proud to admit, for the possibility that her marriage to Alessio Moretti was something she might eventually need to survive. Women who love dangerous men often do that. They keep a go-bag in the back of a closet. They maintain a bank account in their own name. They memorize the number of a lawyer who handles family matters for people in complicated situations. They do all of this without ceremony, without drama, without ever letting themselves believe they'll need it. And then they need it. She didn't look back, not at the city she was leaving, not at the life she had tried to build inside a man who turned out to still be haunted by a different one. She drove through the night with the photo on the passenger seat. She talked to the baby. She didn't plan that either. It just happened. Her voice coming out quiet and a little unsteady, narrating the passing dark, the highway markers, the first gray suggestion of dawn appearing at the edges of the sky. "We're going to be okay," she said. "I don't entirely know how yet, but we are." The baby kicked, small, rolling, definitive. She laughed, or she cried. It was hard to tell the difference, in that car, in that dark, with everything she had been so sure of dissolving in the rearview mirror. Somewhere in the middle of the night, she passed a sign she didn't bother reading. She kept going. Behind her, in a house full of burning lights, A man who controlled half the city's criminal infrastructure was about to realize that the most careful, devastating, and perfectly executed disappearance he would ever encounter had been arranged not by a rival or an enemy, but by the only woman who had ever made him lower his hands. And she had done it without a single word, without a goodbye, with nothing left behind except a thin gold ring on a kitchen counter and the unbearable, absolute silence of a nursery no one had ever used. The ring was cold. Alessio noticed that first, not its presence on the counter, not what it meant, but the temperature of it when he picked it up. He'd come into the kitchen at 11:17 at night because he hadn't eaten since morning, and his body had finally overridden his brain long enough to demand something. He'd been in the study for 4 hours, working, or doing the thing he called working, when what he was actually doing was sitting in a chair staring at documents without reading them, because Vivian had left the house at 9, and the silence she left behind was a different kind of silence than the one that existed before she arrived. He'd known that even while she was still standing in his living room. He'd known it the moment her hands closed around his wrists. He'd thought, this is a mistake. And then he'd let it go on for another 30 seconds before stepping back, because Alessio Moretti had spent his entire adult life knowing something was a mistake and doing it anyway, and apparently marriage had not cured him of that. He picked up the ring. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked through the house. I went to the bedroom first. Her side of the closet was open, not emptied. She hadn't taken everything, and for one terrible second that gave him something close to hope. The specific, pathetic hope of a man who wants to believe he's misreading a situation. But then he looked more carefully. The things that remained were the things that could be replaced. What was gone was a different category entirely. The small things. The things with no resale value and no obvious presence. The things you only notice are missing when you know what to look for. He went to the study, then the bathroom, then, and this was the one that stopped him cold in the doorway, the nursery. They'd been setting it up slowly. Naomi's idea of slowly was different from his. She'd said she didn't want to rush it, didn't want to count on things before they were certain. What that had actually looked like was a room that was halfway between potential and real. A crib assembled but unmade, a small bookshelf with a dozen books already arranged by color, a rocking chair in the corner that Naomi had found at an estate sale and refinished herself over 3 weekends, working in the garage with her sleeves rolled up and sawdust on her forearms, laughing at something he'd said that he couldn't even remember now. The room smelled like fresh paint. He stood in the doorway and held his dead wife's ring. No, his wife's ring. She wasn't dead. She had walked out. There was a difference. There was an enormous difference. And he listened to the house. Nothing. No footsteps. No water running. No quiet humming that he'd spent 4 years pretending to find irritating and had actually used, without ever admitting it to anyone, including himself, as a kind of sonar. As long as he could hear her moving somewhere in the house, things were measurable. Things had edges. He called her phone. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording, casual, slightly distracted, the way she always sounded when she was doing 2 things at once, hit him somewhere below the ribs. He hung up. Called again. Voicemail. He called a 3rd time, and this time he left a message. He said her name. Then he said, "Come home." Then he ended the call because there was nothing after that. He didn't know what came after that. He had never in his life had to ask someone to come back to him. And the experience of it, the standing in an empty nursery with a phone in one hand and a ring in the other, saying "come home" into a recording, was so foreign to him that for a moment he simply couldn't process it as something happening to him personally. It felt like something he was watching. He called Marco at midnight. Marco answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he already knew something was wrong. "She's gone," Alessio said. A pause. "Gone how?" "Gone." He looked at the ring in his palm. "I need you to find her." Another pause. Longer. "Boss, don't." The word came out flat and final. "I don't want a conversation. I want her found, tonight." Marco said, "Okay." And that was it. That was the whole call. She wasn't found that night. She wasn't found the next day either, or the day after that. Marco ran the standard searches, phone records, credit card activity, traffic cameras, the network of eyes and ears. Alessio had spent 2 decades building across the city and its surrounding infrastructure. All of it came back empty. Her phone had been turned off as of 11:48 the previous evening, which was roughly 40 minutes after she'd left the house. Her bank account, the one he knew about, had no activity. The car she'd been driving wasn't picked up on any traffic system heading in any direction. She prepared for this, Marco said, and he said it carefully, standing in the kitchen with his jacket still on like he wasn't sure he was staying. She didn't just leave on impulse, she planned it. Alessio was sitting at the kitchen table. He hadn't slept. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night before. There was a cup of coffee in front of him that had been hot an hour ago and was now a cold brown circle. "How long?" he said. Marco didn't pretend not to understand. "I don't know. Could be weeks. Could be longer." The muscle in Alessio's jaw moved. "There's another account," Marco continued. "Under her name, different bank. We didn't know about it. It was opened 18 months ago." He set a printout on the table. "She's been putting money in steadily, not big amounts, small enough that they wouldn't flag." Alessio looked at the printout. 18 months. He thought about Naomi 18 months ago. He thought about what life had looked like then. They'd been married 2 years at that point. She'd been talking about maybe trying for a child. She'd been, he'd thought, happy, or approaching something that looked like it from the outside. He had believed that. He had told himself he believed it. Now he was sitting here looking at evidence that 18 months ago his wife had started quietly building herself an emergency exit, and the thing that was crawling up his chest wasn't anger. It was something colder and more accurate. It was recognition. She'd known. Not specifically, not what she would walk in on, not the particular shape of it, but she'd known, the way women who pay careful attention to the men they love eventually know, that there was something in him that hadn't been fully surrendered. Something that might, under the right circumstances, assert itself in a way she wouldn't be able to absorb. She'd been right. He picked up the printout and folded it in half and set it back down and said, "Find Vivian." Marco's expression didn't change. That was one of the things Alessio had always appreciated about him, the ability to hear something and simply register it without editorializing. "Okay," he said, "what do you want me to do when I find her?" "Nothing. I'll talk to her myself." Vivian was staying at the Harwick, which was the kind of hotel that cost more per night than most people spent on rent, and which had the kind of front desk staff who were paid to be selectively blind. She opened the door when he knocked, and for a moment they just looked at each other. She was dressed. Her hair was done. She looked like she'd been awake for hours, which she probably had. She looked, he thought, like someone who had spent the night rehearsing a conversation. He didn't give her the version she'd rehearsed. "She's gone," he said. Vivian's face shifted. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, she saw us, and now she's gone." She put one hand on the doorframe. "Alessio, I'm not here for comfort," he said. I'm here because I need to know if she reached out to you, if she said anything, if there's anything you know." "Why would she reach out to me?" "She wouldn't, I know that." He ran a hand over his face. He hadn't slept, and it was showing. He could feel it showing, which was a thing that almost never happened to him. "I just needed to stand somewhere and tell someone, and you're the only person I could—" He stopped. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "You need to understand something," she said, and her voice was careful but not unkind. "I came here because I believed you still felt something, and I wanted to know if I was right. That's why I came. Not to take something from her, not to wreck your—" She stopped too. "But I'm not going to stand here and pretend last night didn't happen, and I'm also not going to pretend it should have." He looked at her. "She was pregnant," he said. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing in the room. Vivian closed her eyes. "How far along?" "I don't know. I found out from a voicemail she left me 3 weeks ago about a doctor's appointment. I haven't told anyone. She was going to tell me last night." He said it flatly. No performance, no request for absolution. Just the facts in the order they'd happened, the way he recited operational details, because that was the only mode he had for things that were too large to feel directly. "She came home to tell me about the baby, and instead she saw—" He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. "You have to find her," Vivian said. "I'm trying." "Try harder." Her voice cracked on the second word. Not for herself. He could hear the difference. "Alessio, Try harder than you've ever tried for anything. He looked at her one last time. Then he walked back down the hallway toward the elevator, and behind him he heard Vivian close the door, and the sound of it had the specific finality of a chapter ending. Not dramatically, not with a slam, but with the quiet click of something that had been held open for too long finally settling shut. The weeks that followed did something to Alessio that no rival, no threat, no loss of territory or money or power had ever managed to do. They humbled him. He spent the first 2 weeks in operational mode, which was the only mode he trusted. He assigned 3 of his best people full-time to locating Naomi. He offered substantial money, not a number he ever said out loud in company, but large enough that it created its own kind of gravity, to anyone in his network who could produce a confirmed sighting. He put out quiet pressure through channels that didn't technically exist, pulling in favors from men in 3 different states who owed him things that couldn't be settled with cash. Nothing. In the 3rd week, a man named Torres came to him with a tip. He said he'd seen a woman matching Naomi's description at a bus terminal 2 states over, traveling with an older woman carrying a single bag. Alessio drove 5 hours personally to follow up on it. He stood in the terminal for 2 hours waiting and eventually approached the woman Torres had described, who turned out to be neither Naomi nor anyone who had ever heard of her. He drove back in silence. In the car, alone, somewhere on a highway in the dark, he hit the steering wheel once with the heel of his hand. Not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to feel the impact. He'd needed to know he still had a body. When he got back, he called Torres into a room and made clear, without raising his voice or touching him, that the consequences of wasting his time would be specific and would last. Torres left pale and immediately began making arrangements to relocate his family to another city, which Alessio would later learn about and not bother to prevent, because he no longer cared enough about Torres to invest the energy. That was new. The not caring. He had always been a man of focused attention. If something was in his field, he noticed it completely. Now he was finding that everything outside of Naomi's absence had begun to gray out at the edges, like a painting left too long in direct sun. Marco noticed. Of course Marco noticed. He'd been with Alessio for 14 years, which meant he'd been with him through more dangerous things than grief, but also meant he'd never seen Alessio grieve, and the sight of it seemed to unsettle him in a way that nothing operational ever had. They were sitting in the office, the real office, not the legitimate front downtown, but the back room in the building on Callaway that smelled like old wood and motor oil. And Marco had just finished a rundown of the month's numbers, which were fine, which were exactly what they always were, which meant absolutely nothing. "You should eat," Marco said. Alessio looked at him. "You haven't eaten today. I know because Sal brought lunch at noon and your plate came back full, and Sal mentioned it because—" Marco stopped. "Because he noticed. Sal should concentrate on his job. Your job is also your job." Marco held his gaze. "And right now you're losing about 40% effectiveness because you're running on, 'I'm running fine.' You sent 2 guys to check out a lead in Portland that I'd already cleared as cold 2 days before." Marco said it quietly. No accusation, just fact. "You've been in this office until 3 in the morning for the past 11 nights. Dario asked me yesterday if you were sick. What did you tell him?" "I told him you were managing a complicated situation." Marco paused, which is one way to put it. Alessio was quiet for a moment. Then, "She planned this for 18 months, Marco. While I was sitting across from her at dinner every night, while we were—" He stopped. "I didn't know." "No. How did I not know?" Marco looked at the table. "Because she didn't want you to know. And she's smarter than most people you underestimate." "I didn't underestimate her." "You assumed she'd stay," Marco said. "That's the same thing." It was the most direct thing Marco had ever said to him in 14 years of working together. They both felt the weight of it. Alessio didn't respond, which was itself a response, and Marco seemed to understand that too because he stood up and said he'd check in tomorrow and left without waiting to be dismissed. Alessio sat in the office alone. After a while, he took out his phone and called Naomi's number again, even though it had been disconnected for 6 weeks by that point. He just listened to the automated voice tell him the number was no longer in service. He did this the way some people press on a bruise, not for pleasure, but for proof, to confirm that the pain was real and belonged to him. He ended the call. He looked at the ring, which he now kept in the inside pocket of his jacket, right over his chest. He didn't examine the symbolism of that. He just put it there one morning and hadn't moved it since. Vivian called him on a Thursday, about 5 weeks after the night everything fell apart. He almost didn't answer. He stared at the screen for 4 rings before something practical in him overrode everything else. The possibility that she'd heard something, that she had information, that there was a reason beyond the obvious one for her to be calling. "I'm leaving the city," she said. No preamble. "I wanted you to know." "Okay. I'm not—" She paused. "I'm not calling to start anything. I just needed to say to you directly that what happened between us—" Another pause. Longer. "I'm sorry. For my part in it." "You don't owe me an apology." "I'm not apologizing to you, Alessio." Her voice was steady. "I'm apologizing for Naomi, who doesn't know I'm doing it and probably wouldn't want it, and who I don't expect to ever speak to me, but—" A breath. She didn't deserve what she walked into. He didn't say anything. "Take care of yourself," Vivian said. "Find her if you can. And if you do—" She stopped again. "Don't go to her the way you usually go to things. You understand what I mean." He understood. He said nothing. The call ended. He sat with the phone in his hand for a while. Outside the window, the city was doing what the city always did, functioning, indifferent, moving through its patterns like a system that had long since forgotten it was made of people. He'd spent his whole life using that indifference, building infrastructure in it, hiding inside it when he needed to. Now it just looked exhausting. It was a night in late November, nearly 3 months after Naomi disappeared, when the first crack appeared in the structure Alessio had built around his guilt. He'd been keeping it contained, not processed, contained. There's a difference, and he knew the difference. He'd been containing things since childhood. Grief, specifically, had a texture he recognized, the way it sat just below the functional surface of a day, dense and pressurized, and as long as you didn't stop moving, it stayed down. He stopped moving. He didn't mean to. He'd come home from a meeting that ran 3 hours past its scheduled end, and he'd walked through the front door and turned on the lights, all of them, the way he always did. And he'd walked down the hall and into the kitchen, and he'd started making coffee. He made 2 cups. He stood at the counter with his hand on the second mug before he understood what he'd done. He stood very still. The coffee maker hissed. The kitchen was too quiet. The ring was in his chest pocket, and the nursery door was down the hall, closed now because he couldn't walk past it open anymore. And the second cup of coffee he'd made by pure muscle memory was sitting on the counter next to his own, and it was going to cool down, and he was going to pour it down the drain, and tomorrow night he would probably do this again because apparently his hands remembered something his brain was still refusing to fully accept. He sat down on the kitchen floor. He didn't plan that. His knees just went. He was on the floor, back against the cabinet, both cups of coffee on the counter above him, and his face was doing something he hadn't let it do since he was 7 years old in a house he never talked about. He let it. He sat there for a long time. When he finally got up, he rinsed both mugs. He dried them. He put them back. He went to the nursery and stood in the doorway and looked at the rocking chair Naomi had refinished with her own hands. And he made a decision that wasn't dramatic and wasn't announced to anyone and cost him something he couldn't quantify. He was going to find her, not because she owed him a conversation, not because he had rights to assert or losses to reclaim, not because the Mafia Boss who ran the eastern infrastructure of the city's criminal machinery didn't accept losing. He was going to find her because she was carrying his child in a world he could not currently protect, and the only honest thing he could do with the rest of the night was sit with how badly he had failed them both. The call came in at 2:15 in the morning 4 days later. It was a man named Petrov, loosely affiliated, someone Alessio had used twice as a peripheral contact, not inner circle, not someone he'd shared sensitive information with. Petrov called Marco first, which was correct protocol, and Marco called Alessio, which meant Petrov's information had passed Marco's preliminary threshold, which meant it might be real. Alessio was out the door before Marco finished the sentence. He drove to the meeting point, a bar on the south side that was closed at that hour, but that Petrov had a key to, which told Alessio something about Petrov's other associations that he filed for later. The bar smelled like old beer and industrial cleaner. Petrov was sitting at a stool in the dark, and when Alessio came through the door, he stood up with the specific posture of a man who was trying to project calm and wasn't quite managing it. "Talk," Alessio said. Petrov talked. He'd been doing work in a mid-sized city about 400 miles northeast. Legitimate work, logistics, nothing connected to Alessio's operation. Through a contact there, he'd heard about a young woman, recently arrived, living in a modest rental, visibly pregnant. The description was general enough to mean nothing except that Petrov had seen a photograph. The contact had sent it, taken without permission, which Alessio would also address at some point, and Petrov had recognized her. He held out his phone. Alessio looked at the photograph. The image was blurry, low light, taken from across a street, which meant the person taking it had been at distance. But the subject was walking toward a building entrance, and even in the blur, even from behind, even with 5 months of changed circumstance, the way she held her coat closed with one hand, the particular angle of her head, something in the posture that he would have known in a room full of strangers. There was no question. He handed the phone back. He asked Petrov 2 questions, the name of the city and the name of Petrov's contact. He got both answers. He stood there for a moment with the information inside him, feeling it land and settle, and something in his chest that had been compressed for 3 months loosened by 1 degree. Just 1. He thanked Petrov, which was unusual enough that Petrov looked faintly alarmed. He told him the information would be worth something, which was as close as he came to expressing gratitude in operational contexts. Then he drove home. He did not call Marco. He did not begin making arrangements. He sat in his car in the driveway of the house that had 2 untouched coffee cups worth of silence in it every morning, and he held his phone and he thought. He thought about what he would do with this information. He could go to her. Immediately. With resources, with security, with the full weight of everything he was, and he could find her and he could… What? Demand? Ask? He knew what his instinct said. His instinct said, go, retrieve, secure. That was the only language his instincts operated in. The language of control and proximity, and the belief that if he could just get close enough to a problem, he could solve it. But Naomi wasn't a problem, and he had already, by using precisely that logic, destroyed the most important thing in his life once. He had treated her, not cruelly, not deliberately, but with the particular carelessness of a man who assumed the important things would stay where he put them, as something in his possession, something that would remain. She had shown him, with 18 months of quiet preparation and a wedding ring placed on a counter without a single word of accusation, exactly what that assumption was worth. He put the phone in his pocket. He went inside. He made 1 cup of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with it, and he thought about what a man who wanted to be different would do with the information he now had, and how different that looked from what every cell in his body was currently demanding. And he had just begun to arrive at something. Not a plan, not yet, just the first dim shape of a different kind of decision, when his phone buzzed with a message from Marco that changed the equation entirely. The message was 4 words and a name, and the name was someone from Alessio's past, the kind of past you didn't leave behind, no matter how many legitimate businesses you opened or how many times you renovated a nursery room. 4 words, Reyes is in town. Alessio read it twice. Then he put the coffee down. Reyes was not a complication. Reyes was not a rival. Reyes was a debt, old, specific, and the kind that didn't wait politely while you sorted out your domestic situation. Reyes was the reason Alessio had spent the last 6 years maintaining 3 separate security protocols at all times. And Reyes being in town meant that the world in which Naomi was living, 400 miles away in a modest rental, slightly pregnant and entirely unprotected, had just become significantly more dangerous. Because Reyes knew about Naomi. And Reyes had never once, in 20 years of doing what he did, made a distinction between a man and the people that man loved. Alessio stood up from the kitchen table. He picked up the phone and he called Marco, and when Marco answered, he said, without introduction, "How long has Reyes been in the city?" "We think 3 days," Marco said. "Maybe 4. He's being careful. Who knows he's here?" "On our side? Me, now you, and Dario." Dario spotted him this afternoon near the Callaway building. Near the Callaway building, near the office. Which meant Reyes wasn't here on unrelated business. Which meant Reyes had either heard about Naomi's disappearance and decided the timing was useful, or, and this was the thought that landed like ice water, Reyes had known about it before Alessio even understood what had happened, which would mean Alessio's network had a leak he hadn't found yet. "Bring Dario to me," he said. "Now? It's almost 3. Now, Marco." He ended the call. He stood in his kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and a phone, and the weight of every decision he'd ever made pressing down on the back of his neck. And he understood, with the specific, merciless clarity that only comes when you have run out of room to rationalize, that the life he'd been living had finally caught up to the space where his family used to be. He had told himself for 3 months that finding Naomi was about love, about remorse, about becoming something better. But Reyes was in town. And if Reyes found her before Alessio did, there would be nothing left to find. Dario arrived at 20 minutes past 3 in the morning, looking like a man who had been yanked out of sleep and knew better than to complain about it. I was 31, compact, with the kind of face that didn't give much away under normal circumstances. But he'd been with Alessio's organization for 6 years, which meant he'd been in enough rooms where things went badly to have developed a specific kind of stillness. The stillness of someone who enters a space and immediately reads its temperature before doing anything else. He read this room. He stood by the kitchen doorway with his hands loose at his sides and waited. Marco came in behind him and closed the door and stayed near it. Alessio was standing at the counter. He hadn't sat down since the call. He had the phone face down on the counter next to him, and he was looking at Dario with the particular quality of attention that his men had learned over the years to take seriously. Not loud, not theatrical, just complete, like a door swinging fully open. "Tell me exactly where you saw Reyes," he said. Dario told him. "Callaway Street, northeast corner, 4:17 in the afternoon." Reyes was in a gray sedan, passenger seat, moving slowly past the building. Dario had been coming out of the side entrance and had caught the profile through the window. Half a second, maybe less. But he'd spent 2 years in an operation that put him in the same room as Reyes 3 times, and a face like that didn't fade. "You're certain," Alessio said. "I'm certain." "Who was driving?" "I didn't get a clear look. Male, larger build, that's all I have." Alessio nodded once, then he said, "How long have you been reporting to Reyes?" The kitchen went completely still. Dario's face didn't move. That was the tell. Not a flinch, not a protest, not the immediate burst of denial that an innocent man produces when accused of something like that. Just nothing. For 1 second too long, nothing. Then Dario said, "Boss, don't." Alessio's voice was almost gentle. That was the part that made Marco shift his weight near the door. The gentleness. "I've known something was wrong with my information flow for 8 weeks. I ran 4 controlled tests. Different details sent through different channels. No overlap. Reyes responding to things he shouldn't have been able to know. 3 out of 4 traces led back to a node." He picked up his phone, set it down again. "The 4th one I held back. Information about Naomi's location. I got it tonight. I haven't told anyone. And yet," he paused. "Reyes is in the city." Dario said nothing. "He was already coming," Alessio said. "Wasn't he? Before I even had the location, because you gave it to him." "I don't have her location." Dario's voice was flat. "I don't know where she is." "No, but you told him I was looking. You told him I was close. And Reyes is smart enough to know that when I get close, I get there." Alessio moved away from the counter. Not toward Dario, just away from the counter, creating different geometry in the room. "So he came here to use me as the tracker. Follow me to her." Dario's jaw tightened. "How long?" Alessio said. A long silence. Marco hadn't moved. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, very faintly, a car passed on the street. 14 months, Dario said. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a height. 14 months. Which meant it had started before Naomi disappeared. Which meant, and this was the part that hit Alessio with the specific violence of something you don't see coming even when you should have. Dario had been feeding information while Naomi was still in the house, while she was still sleeping down the hall, while she was putting baby books on a shelf by color. "Why?" Marco said from the door. He said it the way you ask a question when the answer won't change anything, but you need it anyway. Dario looked at the floor. "My brother owed Reyes money, a lot. Reyes was going to—" He stopped. "He said he'd clear the debt." "And has he?" Alessio said. A pause. "No." Alessio looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and he called a number, and when it answered, he said 3 words and ended the call. He looked at Marco. Take him somewhere and keep him there, he said. Don't hurt him. I may need to talk to him again. Marco moved. Dario went with him without resistance, which was perhaps the only thing he did that night that showed any intelligence at all. Alessio stood alone in his kitchen. He stood there for a while. Then he did something he almost never did at 3 a.m. He sat down at the kitchen table and he put his head in his hands and he stayed there. Not long. Maybe 90 seconds. But he stayed there, and in those 90 seconds he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had just rearranged itself. Reyes wasn't here because of a vendetta. Reyes was here because Reyes had been inside Alessio's operation for over a year, and the thing he'd been building toward, slowly, the way Reyes always worked, the way a man builds a trap rather than a fight, was leverage. And Naomi was the leverage, had always been the leverage. Even before she disappeared, she was the leverage, which meant that the night she walked in and found him with Vivian, and the night she left, and the 3 months of silence that followed, all of it had been happening inside a situation Alessio hadn't known he was already in. He raised his head. He needed to get to Naomi before Reyes did, and he needed to do it in a way that didn't lead Reyes directly to her, because Dario wasn't the only set of eyes in his organization. He knew that now, and every move he made from this point forward was potentially visible to someone he hadn't identified yet. He picked up his phone. He didn't call Marco. He didn't call anyone in his current network. He called a number that he hadn't used in 4 years, that belonged to a man named Carver, who had retired from the kind of work Alessio did, and now lived quietly in a city 200 miles west, and owed Alessio a favor of the kind that doesn't expire. Carver answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he was a light sleeper and always had been. I need something quiet, Alessio said. No trail, no people I currently employ. A pause. What kind of something? Transportation and a location confirmed without triggering anything connected to me. Another pause. Then, give me 6 hours. He didn't sleep. He spent the hours between Carver's call and dawn doing something that felt strange and procedural and entirely necessary. He dismantled. He went through his phone and removed or altered anything that constituted a trail to Naomi. He thought carefully about what Dario had had access to. He thought about the 4 controlled tests and what each one had revealed and what the gaps between them meant. By 5 a.m, he had a rough map of where the leaks were and where they weren't. The internal network, the day-to-day operational structure, was compromised at Dario's level and possibly 1 level above him. The outer contacts, the peripheral people like Petrov, were cleaner. Reyes had been using Dario as a tap, not as an infiltrator, which meant the damage was in information flow rather than structural control. That was something. Not much, but something. At 6:40, Carver called back. He had a vehicle, clean plates, no registration connection to anything of Alessio's. He had a man in the northeastern city who could do a physical confirmation without drawing attention, someone Carver trusted, and Alessio had no prior connection to. He had a route that avoided the 2 most obvious surveillance points on the roads leaving the city. You're going yourself, Carver said. It wasn't a question. Yes. That's not smart. No, Alessio said. It's not. A pause. Okay. He left the house at 7:15 carrying almost nothing. No security? No car from his regular rotation. He'd arranged a vehicle through Carver's contact, nondescript, waiting 2 blocks over in a parking structure. He walked to it with his hands in his coat pockets, and the ring against his chest, and the specific sensation of a man walking out of one version of his life, and not entirely certain there was another version on the other side. The drive was long. He stopped once for gas and coffee, paying cash, and stood outside the station for a moment in the cold morning air, with the cup warming his hands, and the highway stretching in both directions like something that didn't know it was supposed to have an end. He thought about what he would say. He'd been avoiding thinking about this, about the actual moment, the actual words, what her face would do when she saw him at her door. He'd told himself that he would figure it out when he got there, which was the kind of thing a man tells himself when he knows that no amount of preparation will be adequate, and so he might as well stop wasting energy on it. But on the highway, alone, with 4 hours still ahead of him, he let himself think about it. He thought about the last time he'd seen her face. He hadn't actually seen it that night. She'd been in the doorway, in the dark, and he'd been looking at Vivian, and by the time he might have turned around, she was already gone. So the last real image he had of Naomi was from earlier that day, before the meeting that had run too late, before Vivian showed up unannounced with 17 years of unfinished history. Naomi at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, frowning at something on her laptop, not looking up when he came in, but lifting two fingers off the keyboard in a gesture that meant, "I see you. Give me a minute." He'd poured himself a drink and leaned in the doorway and waited, and she'd eventually looked up over the glasses and said, "You're hovering. I'm standing. Same thing." He'd laughed. She'd gone back to her laptop. He'd gone to his meeting. That was the last time. He pressed the gas, and the car moved through the pale winter landscape, and he didn't let himself think about it anymore. Carver's contact in the northeastern city was a woman named Bess who managed a dry cleaning business and had the quiet, capable manner of someone who had lived several different lives before the current one. She met him at a parking lot 2 miles from the address and gave him a confirmation that was just a nod and a folded piece of paper with an apartment number on it. He looked at the paper. "She goes out in the mornings," Bess said. "Around 9. She walks to the market on 4th. Takes about 20 minutes. She's—" A pause. "She's very pregnant." He looked at the paper. "Thank you," he said. Bess walked back to her car without another word. He sat in the parking lot for 15 minutes. Then he drove to the address. It was an apartment building. 3 stories, older, the kind with a buzzer panel by the front door and a small lobby that smelled like carpet cleaner and someone's cooking from 2 floors up. He didn't buzz. He found an unlocked side door and went in and took the stairs to the 2nd floor and stood in the hallway outside apartment 2C. He raised his hand to knock. He stood there. He lowered his hand. He stood there for another 30 seconds doing something he had almost no practice at, being afraid of a door, of what was on the other side of it. Not physically afraid. He had faced things in his life that had required actual courage and had mostly managed it without performance. This was different. This was the kind of afraid that has no tactical solution. The kind where you can't protect yourself by being smarter or faster or better armed. The kind where all you can do is knock and then be whatever you are and hope it's enough. He knocked. He heard movement inside, slow, careful, then silence. The specific silence of someone looking through a peephole. A long pause. Then Naomi's voice, through the door, completely flat. "Go away, Alessio." He closed his eyes for 1 second. "I need 5 minutes," he said. "You don't get 5 minutes. Naomi, I said go away." He put one hand flat on the door, not pushing, just there. "You're not safe here. That's why I came, not for—" He stopped, started again. "Someone who wants to hurt me knows where you are. I need you to listen to me." Silence. Then the sound of a deadbolt turning. She opened the door and stood in the gap with one hand still on the frame, and the first thing he saw was that she was further along than he'd calculated. 8 months, maybe. Possibly more. She was wearing a gray sweater and her hair was different, shorter, which he wasn't prepared for, and it made her look simultaneously younger and like a woman who had made a series of decisions without consulting anyone. Her face was— he didn't have a word for her face. It was the face he knew completely, and a face he had no right to anymore, and both of those things were true at the same time, and they did not resolve. She looked at him the way you look at something you've imagined for months, and are now furious to find looks exactly the same. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "Talk." He talked. He kept it operational because that was the only way he could give her the information without it becoming something else. He told her about Reyes, about the timeline, about Dario, about what it meant that his network had been compromised for 14 months. He told her that Reyes knew she existed, knew she mattered to him, and that Reyes had never operated with any particular interest in innocence or proximity or the question of whether someone was directly involved in what he was avenging. He told her she needed to move. Not back to the city. Somewhere he could arrange protection without a direct connection to himself. He had a location in mind. He had people outside his current network who could be trusted. She listened without interrupting. That itself surprised him. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. He'd imagined this conversation in about 14 different versions, and in most of them she'd slammed the door by now. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long have I been in danger?" she said. "Since you left. Possibly before." Before. Her voice changed on that word. Not louder, sharper. "Before I left. While we were still—" She stopped. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. So this entire time, everything I did to get myself out, everything I planned, I walked out of one dangerous situation directly into another one because you— Yes, he said. He didn't dress it up. She didn't need him to. She turned away from him and walked back into the apartment, leaving the door open, which he understood to mean come in rather than leave. He came in. The apartment was small and clean and had the particular feeling of a space that had been made habitable through sheer force of will. A few things on the windowsill, a blanket over the back of a chair, books stacked on an improvised shelf of boards and milk crates. On the kitchen table there was a half-finished cup of tea and a notebook with handwriting in it. He couldn't read from here. It looked like her, not like their house, but like her. He stood near the door. She stood by the kitchen table with her back to him and her hands flat on the table, and he could see her breathing, the slight movement of her shoulders, the deliberate pace of it. "How long do I have?" she said. "I don't know. Reyes moves carefully. He'll try to follow me rather than come directly, so I was careful coming here, but I can't promise you more than a few days." "And the baby?" She said it quietly, facing the wall. "What happens to the baby in your plan?" "The baby goes with you," he said. "Wherever you go. That's not—" He stopped. "That was never a question for me." She turned around. She looked at him for a long moment, and the look was not warm and was not forgiving and was not a step toward anything other than what it was. A woman deciding how much of what she was feeling she was going to let him see. "Sit down," she said. "You look terrible." He sat down. She made tea because apparently that was what she did now, in this life she'd built without him. She made tea, and she kept her hands busy, and she managed things. She set a cup in front of him without asking, and sat across the table and wrapped both hands around her own cup, and looked at him again. "Tell me the whole thing," she said. "Not the operational version, the whole thing." He told her. He told her more than he'd planned. He told her about Dario, about the 14 months, about the controlled tests, about driving 4 hours in a borrowed car because he was afraid to trust anyone he currently employed. He told her about the ring in his pocket, which he took out and set on the table between them, not as a gesture, but because it seemed dishonest to keep it hidden at this particular moment. She looked at the ring. She didn't touch it. "Why do you have that?" she said. "I've been carrying it." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because it's mine," he said. "It was always mine. I just didn't—" He stopped again. He seemed to keep stopping in this conversation. The sentences kept finding edges he hadn't anticipated. "I didn't deserve it." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then the baby moved. He could see it, the slight shift under the fabric of her sweater, the way her hand went automatically to her side, the brief distraction of it on her face. Something that wasn't quite a smile, not quite that, but adjacent to it, involuntary. He watched that happen. It was the most devastating thing he had seen in 3 months. "His name is Noah," she said. She wasn't looking at him when she said it. She was looking at her own hand on her side. "I decided that a month ago." He didn't say anything. "You don't get to weigh in on that," she said, still not looking at him. "I'm just telling you." "I know," he said. "Thank you." She looked up at him then. Whatever she saw in his face, whatever she read there, seemed to land somewhere uncomfortable because she looked away again quickly. "Finish your tea," she said. "Then you need to tell me exactly how we're doing this." They spent 2 hours at that table. By the end of it, there was a plan. Not a good plan. Alessio was too honest with himself to call it that, but a workable one. Carver would arrange transit to a property in a different state, owned by someone with no connection to Alessio's organization. Naomi would travel with Bess and one other person Carver would provide. Alessio would go back to the city and create enough visible noise in his own operation to convince anyone watching that he hadn't found her yet, that he was still searching, that following him would lead nowhere useful. It was the kind of plan that had 7 different points at which it could fail. He didn't tell her that. She probably knew anyway. He was standing to leave, the tea finished, the details settled, the air in the apartment doing the specific thing that air does when a conversation has exhausted everything it was permitted to contain. When her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Her face changed. "What?" he said. She turned the phone so he could see the screen. It was a message, no name attached, from a number she didn't have saved. The message was 4 words and an image. The 4 words, We know she's there. The image was a photograph, taken from outside through the window. This window, the kitchen window, the one behind her that looked out onto the street below. The photograph showed the inside of this apartment, showed this kitchen table, showed both of them sitting at it. It had been taken less than 30 minutes ago. Alessio looked at the photograph for 1 second. 1 second was all he needed. He moved. He went to the window first and stood to the side of it, not in front of it, and looked down at the street. It was a winter morning, thin light, a few people moving on the sidewalks. A car parked across the street that had been there when he arrived. He looked at the car. The windows were slightly fogged, the specific fogging of a window that has someone breathing behind it. Bag, he said. Now, whatever matters. You have 3 minutes. 3. Naomi. He turned from the window. He said her name the way he'd said it on that voicemail 3 months ago, without any armor in it at all. Please, 3 minutes. She moved. She was faster than he expected. Faster and more prepared, which he should have anticipated. She had been a woman with an emergency bag since before she needed one. In 2.5 minutes, she had a bag on her shoulder and her coat on and her phone in her hand, and she was standing by the door looking at him with her jaw set and her eyes completely clear. She was 8 months pregnant, and she had just been told she was being watched, and she was not falling apart. He looked at her, and something in him, not something small, shifted permanently. Backstairs, he said. End of the hall. He called Carver while they moved. The call lasted 45 seconds. Carver asked one question and Alessio answered it, and that was the whole conversation. They took the back stairs down to the alley exit, and the cold hit them both when the door opened and Naomi exhaled a sharp breath and kept moving. They were 2 blocks away when he heard, behind them, and with a silence that was somehow louder than noise, the sound of the apartment building's front door opening. He didn't look back. He put his hand on Naomi's arm, not gripping, just present, and said quietly, "Don't run. Walk like you know where you're going." "I don't know where I'm going," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "Walk anyway." She walked. He walked beside her. And behind them, somewhere in the winter street, someone who had been paid to find the one thing Alessio Moretti had never managed to protect was making a call of his own, telling someone that the target was on the move, that the husband was with her, and that the situation had changed in a way that was going to require a decision that none of them had been fully prepared to make, until right now, until this moment, until the woman and the man and the child between them stepped out of the last safe space they had, and into a city that was no plan survives the first 30 seconds. Alessio had known that for 20 years. It was the first real thing this life had taught him. Not strategy, not patience, not how to read a room or hold a secret or make a man afraid without touching him. The first real thing was simpler and harder than all of those. The moment everything starts moving, the plan becomes decoration. What keeps you alive after that is the part of you that doesn't need to think. He was running on that part now. They were 2.5 blocks from the apartment when he heard the car. Not the engine, the absence of it. A vehicle that had been idling suddenly going quiet, which is a sound most people don't register because most people have never had a reason to. He registered it immediately, and the registration came not as thought but as a physical change. Something in his spine, something in the way his hand, which was at his side and not touching Naomi, moved fractionally toward her without his permission. "Cross here," he said. "The lights, cross." They crossed. A cab honked. Naomi moved without breaking stride, her bag on one shoulder, her free hand held slightly out from her body for balance, the way he'd noticed she'd been walking since they left the building. The way you walk when your center of gravity has been renegotiated and you've had to learn your own body again. He didn't look back. Looking back tells the people behind you that you know they're there, and knowing that they know changes the geometry of everything. He called Carver again. The call connected and he said one word, the word they'd established as the signal for the plan having changed entirely. And Carver said, "How far out are you?" And Alessio said, 4 minutes if nothing else changes. And Carver said, "Make it 3." And the line went dead. "Where are we going?" Naomi said. Her voice was controlled. That was the thing about her. She'd always had that quality, the ability to keep her voice level when everything else was in motion. He'd admired it in smaller circumstances. Right now it was the thing keeping him from making a mistake. Parking structure on Elm, 2 blocks north. Then what? Car. Carver's contact. then out of the city before anyone has coordinates on the vehicle. She was quiet for a moment, then, "There's someone behind us." "I know." "Two of them. One is wearing a blue jacket, and the other one has his hands in his pockets, and they've been matching our pace since the corner." He almost stopped walking. Not because she was wrong, she wasn't wrong, but because she had noticed before he could tell her, which meant she'd been tracking her environment with a vigilance she'd apparently developed in the months he hadn't been there to protect her. She had learned to do his job for herself. That landed somewhere complicated. "Don't acknowledge them," he said. "I wasn't planning to." They turned north. The parking structure appeared at the end of the block. A concrete thing, 4 levels, the kind that always smells like exhaust and always has at least one fluorescent light failing on every floor. Carver's contact was on level 2. He'd been told to wait near the south stairwell. They went in through the pedestrian entrance. Alessio let Naomi go first and then turned, not fast, not aggressive, just a man checking the street before stepping inside, and confirmed what he'd already calculated. Blue Jacket was 30 yards back and had slowed. The other one had moved laterally, positioning for the other entrance. They were being herded, not followed. That was different. That meant there was a third point somewhere ahead. He went in. He took Naomi's arm. Not gently, not roughly, firmly, the way you hold something that matters in conditions where things can be lost. She didn't pull away. They moved up the stairwell to the second level, and he could hear her breathing, heavier than usual, which he understood without medical knowledge was because she was 8 months pregnant and climbing stairs quickly, and the understanding of it tightened something in his chest that had no tactical name. "Stop for a second," he said at the landing. "I'm fine." "Naomi, 10 seconds. She stopped. She breathed. Her hand was on the railing and her eyes were closed for exactly those 10 seconds. He counted. And then she opened them and nodded, and they kept moving. The second level was dim, 3 cars, widely spaced. Near the south stairwell, a man was standing with the specific quality of stillness that means waiting, rather than lingering. The difference between a person killing time and a person who has been told to be somewhere at a specific moment. The man was not Carver's contact. Alessio knew this the moment he saw him. The same way he'd known the car had gone quiet. The same way he'd known Dario's non-reaction was a tell. He knew it without analysis, as a simple fact delivered from somewhere below rational thought. He steered Naomi left toward the cars. "Between the vehicles," he said low. "What's now?" She moved between 2 parked cars, and he went with her, and the man by the stairwell had registered the change in their trajectory, was already pushing off the wall. From the north stairwell, another door opened. Blue Jacket and his partner had come up faster than Alessio had given them credit for. That was the mistake. He'd estimated their pace wrong, or they'd run once they were in the stairwell, or there was a third route he hadn't mapped. He was working with bad information in an unfamiliar building with Naomi behind him. He put her against the concrete pillar to his right and turned and put himself between her and the 3 men, who had now formed the triangle he'd anticipated about 45 seconds later than it was actually forming. The man from the south stairwell spoke first. "Moretti." He said it like a fact. "Reyes wants to talk." "Reyes can call me," Alessio said. "That's funny." The man didn't look like he found it funny. He looked like someone who had been given instructions that allowed for flexibility and was deciding how much to use. "Walk with us." "And her," Alessio said. A pause. "Her too. Those are the instructions. The instructions include a pregnant woman." Another pause. This one slightly longer, which told Alessio something about how specific the instructions had actually been, which meant there was distance between what Reyes had ordered and what these 3 were comfortable with. He filed that away immediately. From behind him, Naomi said very quietly, "Alessio." He said, "I see it," without knowing specifically what she was seeing, but knowing it was real because she wouldn't have said it otherwise. What she was seeing was a 4th person coming from the vehicle ramp to their left. A woman, medium height, who moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who considers herself the most dangerous thing in any room she enters. He had seen this person once before. 4 years ago, across a table at a meeting he'd attended as a show of good faith to 3 separate parties who all wanted different things. Her name was Sable. Not her name, the one she operated under. And she was the specific kind of person that Reyes used when he wanted things done with more intelligence than violence, which was most of the time. She was looking at him with an expression that was almost professional in its neutrality. "The building is covered," she said. "All 4 exits. I have 8 people." She said it the way you announce a weather forecast. Factual. No particular feeling about it. "If you'd like to verify that before we continue, I can give you a moment." He didn't need a moment. He believed her. "What does Reyes want?" he said. "A conversation. In person." She glanced at Naomi. The glance was brief, and Alessio watched it carefully. Somewhere more comfortable than a parking structure. And her. "She's incidental," Sable said. "Reyes's quarrel is with you. She can—" Sable paused, and the pause was specific, calibrated. "She can wait somewhere. She's not the objective." "She's not going anywhere with your people," he said. "Then she comes to the conversation." Sable shrugged. "Either way." Behind him, Naomi put her hand on his back, just briefly. He felt it through his jacket. 1 second of contact, and then her hand dropped, but the meaning of it was clear. She wasn't telling him to surrender. She was telling him she was still there, still upright, still thinking. He said, "Where?" They put them in a car. Not cuffed, not restrained, just positioned, one of the 3 men in the front passenger seat, and Sable driving and Blue Jacket in a separate vehicle behind them. And the whole arrangement had the quality of a thing being managed rather than enforced, which was its own kind of warning. Reyes, at his most dangerous, never looked dangerous. Naomi was beside him in the back seat. She was holding her bag in her lap with both hands and looking out the window, and he could see her tracking the route. He was doing the same. North on Elm, east on a street he didn't have a name for, eventually into a neighborhood that was quieter and older, the kind of area where large properties sat behind landscaping that afforded privacy. She leaned slightly toward him, barely, not enough for anyone in the front to read it, and said against his ear, very quietly, "I called someone." He kept his face completely still. "While you were watching the stairwell," she said, "before we went between the cars, I texted an address." "To who?" he said, just his lips moving. "Maya," she breathed. His sister-in-law, who had no connection to his world, who was from any operational standpoint useless as a resource, and who he suddenly understood was exactly the right person to have called, because she was outside every network that Reyes had been monitoring, and because Maya Carter did not know how to be subtle about anything, which meant if she'd been given a location and a situation, she would have done something loud and uncalculated with it, which was possibly the only type of response that nobody in Reyes's organization had planned for. He said nothing. He looked out the window. The car stopped at a property with a long driveway and a house at the end of it. That was the kind of house that money buys when money has been accumulating for a very long time. Not ostentatious, just permanent. The kind of house that assumes it will still be standing when everyone in it is gone. Sable got out and opened Naomi's door first, which was either courtesy or calculation. Naomi got out slowly, her hand braced on the doorframe, her jaw set in the way that meant she was managing discomfort without announcing it. He was out and beside her before she'd finished straightening up, which made Sable look at him with that same professional neutrality. "In," Sable said. They went in. Reyes was smaller than the reputation suggested. That was always true of people like him, Alessio had found. The ones who built the largest infrastructures of fear were rarely physically imposing. They were usually compact and quiet, and had the specific quality of absolute attention. The way they looked at you suggested that you were, at this moment, the only thing in the world that they were concerned with, which was flattering until you understood that the attention was not personal. You were a problem. They were examining the problem. He was sitting in a chair by a window in a room that had good light and very little furniture. He was perhaps 60, with gray at his temples, and a face that had been weathered by things other than sun. He was wearing a jacket and no tie, and reading glasses that he removed when they came in and set on the table beside him, with a careful precision that suggested he treated small objects with the same intentionality he applied to everything else. He looked at Alessio. He looked at Naomi. His expression, observing Naomi's condition, changed in some way that was very small and not particularly kind, but was also, and this was the thing, not entirely without scruple. He looked at Sable, and something passed between them that Alessio couldn't fully read, but that had the quality of a boundary being acknowledged. "Sit," Reyes said. "I'll stand," Alessio said. A pause. Reyes looked at him. She should sit. Naomi sat, not because Reyes had suggested it, but because there was a chair and she was 8 months pregnant and standing indefinitely in a room with bad options required conserving resources. She set her bag down and put her hands on her knees and looked at Reyes with an expression that was so without deference that Alessio saw Reyes notice it. 14 months, Alessio said. That's what you got from Dario. 14 months, Reyes confirmed. What do you want? Reyes looked at him for a moment as if this question was slightly less interesting than he'd hoped. I want what I've always wanted, he said. The Callaway account. Everything in it, everything it represents. The Eastern infrastructure. He said it without particular heat. You've held that for 6 years on the understanding that we had reached an arrangement. The arrangement has been revised. By you. By circumstances. He paused. You've been distracted. Distracted men make bad stewards. And if I disagree, then we remain here until you arrive at a different conclusion. Reyes glanced at Naomi. I'm not an unreasonable man. The woman and the child are not part of this. They can leave whenever an agreement is reached. From her chair, Naomi said, Don't negotiate on my behalf. Reyes looked at her. For the first time, something in his face shifted by a degree that suggested something other than professional evaluation. You're very calm, he said. I've been surviving for 8 months without help, she said. This is not the most frightening room I've been in. A pause. Then, and it was faint, and it was probably not something she was meant to see. Something in Reyes's expression that might, in a different life, have been something adjacent to respect. Alessio was looking at her too. He kept looking at her a second longer than he should have, which was a kind of vulnerability he couldn't afford right now and also couldn't entirely help. He turned back to Reyes. I'll give you the Western accounts, he said. Everything south of the district line, the 2 properties on Mason, the offshore structure through the Cayman contact. That's a third of what I'm asking for. It's what I'm offering. Reyes was quiet. Then, you're negotiating from a position of no leverage. You understand that. I understand it. Alessio held his gaze. I'm still offering what I'm offering, because it's what I can give you and still walk out of here with my family intact, and that's the only outcome I'm willing to consider. The word family sat in the room. Reyes looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Naomi again, then at Alessio again. Give me the room, he said. Sable moved Naomi toward an adjacent space. Not far, a sitting room visible through an open doorway, close enough that Alessio could see her settle into a chair and hear the general shape of what was happening in the main room. Sable stayed in the doorway between. Reyes picked up his reading glasses and then set them down again. I knew your father, he said. Alessio said nothing. Not well. 3 interactions over 2 years before he made the choices that ended those interactions. He paused. He was also a man who didn't understand until too late what he was actually protecting. He looked out the window. I'm not saying this as a lesson. I'm saying it because it's relevant. You've had 6 years of the Callaway infrastructure and you've run it well. I'm not taking it out of vengeance. I'm taking it because you're going to be somewhere else from now on. He paused again. Aren't you? It wasn't quite a question. Alessio looked at him. I want your word, Alessio said. About her. About the child. Your word. Not an arrangement, not a term in a negotiation. My word? Yes. Reyes looked at him for a long time. The light from the window was falling across half his face and leaving the rest in shadow, and he looked like what he was, a man who had been doing something specific for a very long time and had become so deeply shaped by it that the shape was permanent. You have my word, he said. Alessio nodded once. The Eastern accounts by end of week, he said. I'll have Marco arrange. From the sitting room came a sound. It was small, a sharp exhale, but not pain, but close to it. The sound of someone who has been managing something and has reached the edge of how long managing is possible. He was through the doorway before he'd made a decision to move. Naomi was in the chair with her hand pressed to her side and her face contracted in a way that was specific and unmistakable and had nothing to do with Reyes or Sable or any of it. How far apart? He said, crouching in front of her. It's probably not. Naomi. How far apart? She looked at him. Her eyes were fully clear, which meant she was in pain and completely present and furious about the timing. About 8 minutes, she said. For the last hour. He stared at her. I wasn't going to tell you, she said through her teeth, while we were being herded into a car. He put his hand over hers on her side without thinking. She didn't pull away. He looked up at Sable, who was standing in the doorway. I need a car, he said. Now. Sable looked at him. Then she looked at Naomi. Something moved across her face that was more human than anything he'd seen in it since they'd walked in. She turned and said one word into the main room. Reyes appeared in the doorway. He took in the situation in approximately 2 seconds. He said to Sable, My car. Drive them yourself. Sable said, Sir. Drive them yourself, he said again. Flat. Final. Then he looked at Alessio, who was crouched on the floor of his sitting room with his hand over his wife's hand, and his face doing something that the feared and deliberate and architecturally ruthless Alessio Moretti's face was not supposed to be capable of doing. Go, Reyes said. His voice was not unkind. Alessio got Naomi to her feet. She stood, braced for a second against him, one hand on his arm, her weight redistributing, another of those controlled exhales. And then she straightened and she looked at him with an expression that had approximately 7 things in it simultaneously, and which he could not have translated into words under any circumstances. Don't make it weird, she said. I'm not. Your face is making it weird. We need to go. I know we need to go. They went. Sable drove them as the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but is also not something anyone wants to fill. Naomi was in the back seat and Alessio was beside her, and she was timing the contractions on her phone with an app he didn't know existed, which told him something about how long she'd been preparing for this particular version of Alone. 7 minutes apart. Then 6. He called ahead to the nearest hospital. Not his name, not her name, he knew better than that, and gave them the parameters and was told to come to the emergency entrance. Naomi said, during a gap between contractions, You're going to have to wait in the hallway. I know. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because we haven't. I know, he said again. I'll be in the hallway. She looked out the window. A long moment passed. Then, You can stay in the room. He looked at her. If you want, she said to the window. He didn't say anything. He didn't trust what he would say. After a moment, she said, still to the window, He's going to have your eyes. You don't know that yet. I know, she said. I've known for months. He has your eyes. I've seen it in the ultrasounds. A pause. I spent a lot of time being angry about that. He didn't say anything. Less angry now, she said. Moderately angry. That's progress. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and then turned into something else entirely as another contraction arrived, and this one was different from the others. Longer, deeper, the kind that takes up the whole body, and she put her hand on the seat between them, and without any discussion he put his over it, and she gripped it hard until it passed. It passed. She let go. Neither of them said anything about it. The hospital came into view. Sable pulled to the emergency entrance and stopped and turned around to look at them, and then, without a word, got out and opened Naomi's door and stood back. Naomi got out. Alessio got out. They stood outside the emergency entrance in the winter air, and through the glass doors he could see a nurse already moving toward them with a wheelchair, and the world was continuing its pattern of being entirely indifferent to the specific weight of the moment. He looked at Naomi. She was looking at the doors, at the nurse coming, at the chair, at the immediate next thing, the way she had always navigated, through whatever was directly in front of her, without the luxury of considering what came after. Then she looked at him. And for the first time in 3 months, for the first time since the night she stood in a dark doorway, holding an ultrasound photo, while the life she'd built collapsed in front of her, she looked at him without the particular quality of guarded distance she'd been maintaining since she opened the apartment door. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to forgiveness. It was something simpler and rawer than that. She was looking at him the way you look at a person you cannot afford to hate right now, because the next several hours are going to require everything you have, and you need someone in that room who would rather die than let anything happen to you. She was asking him if he was that person. He held the look. The nurse arrived with the chair and said something practical and efficient about how far along and how far apart, and Naomi answered in a voice that was steady and accurate and impressive under any circumstances. The automatic doors slid open. The chair moved. He walked in beside her. Behind them, Sable stood at the car in the cold for a moment, watching. Then she took out her phone and made a call and said, when it was answered, "It's going to be tonight." A pause. Then, "Yes." "A boy." Another pause, longer. "I know. Tell him I said, tell him he was right about her." She ended the call. She got back in the car. In the hospital, past the sliding doors and the fluorescent lobby and the hallway that smelled like every hospital that had ever existed, Naomi Moretti gripped the armrests of a wheelchair and breathed through something that was at once the most ordinary and most violent and most irreversible thing a body can do. And beside her, the most powerful and most broken and most desperately recalibrating man she had ever loved walked at exactly her pace, his hand hovering near her shoulder without quite touching it, waiting to be told what she needed, for once in his life not assuming he already knew. And in the room at the end of the hallway, a set of monitors was already running, and the lights were already adjusted, and somewhere in the particular and irreducible chaos of the next few hours, Noah Moretti was going to arrive into a world that was not ready for him, but would have to become so. And the man who had spent 6 years building an empire out of fear and control and the absolute refusal to be Noah Moretti arrived at 4:37 in the morning. He did not arrive quietly. He arrived the way all new people arrive, with complete disregard for the circumstances, with a total absence of awareness that the world he was entering had been in a state of managed crisis for the past 9 hours, and with a sound that was simultaneously the smallest and largest sound Alessio had ever heard in a room. Alessio was standing against the wall near the window when it happened. He had been in that room for 6 hours. Naomi had not asked him to leave, and he had not asked permission to stay, and they had not discussed it after the hallway, which was the kind of non-agreement that only works between people who still know each other well enough to operate in the gaps. He had stood and sat and stood again. He had gotten ice chips twice and been told once by a nurse that he needed to stop hovering near the monitor because he was making the night staff nervous, which he'd complied with immediately because the nurse had said it with the specific authority of someone who had seen fathers like him before and had no patience for it. He had watched Naomi work. That was the only word for it. Work. He had understood, in some abstract way, what labor meant. He had not understood what it looked like on a specific person, the particular ferocity of it, the way it took her completely and gave her back in pieces, the way she breathed through the worst of it with her eyes closed and her jaw set, and a focus so absolute that he felt, standing against the wall, like something incidental to a process that was vastly larger than either of them. She had not reached for his hand again after the car. He had not offered it. At 4:36, she made a sound he had never heard her make. Not pain exactly, or not only pain, but something that pain was a component of, something that required a different vocabulary than anything he currently had. And at 4:37, the doctor said something efficient and calm, and then there was the other sound. Noah. The specific and entirely unrepeatable sound of a person who has just discovered that they exist. Alessio put his hand flat on the wall behind him. He needed something solid. He needed something that wasn't moving. Because the room was moving, or the quality of the light in it had changed, or something in the fundamental structure of the moment had shifted in a way that had no name in the language of crime or power or money or any of the other languages he'd spent his life becoming fluent in. The nurse said something to Naomi. Naomi made a sound that was different from everything before it. It was the sound of someone setting something down that they have been carrying for a very long time. It was the sound of a person reduced, temporarily, to something prior to language. She was holding him. Alessio looked at his son for the first time from across a hospital room, and Noah, red-faced and furious at the transition he'd just been required to make, eyes not yet open, hands fisted at his sides with the instinctive indignation of the newly born, was the most specific and particular thing he had ever seen. Not beautiful in the way photographs would later suggest. Real. Unambiguously, uncomplicatedly real, in a way that nothing in Alessio's life had prepared him for. The doctor said something to him. He walked across the room. He stood next to Naomi's bed, and he looked down at his son, 4 minutes old, knowing nothing, carrying both of them forward into something neither of them had planned, opened his eyes. Gray. Even then. Even at 4 minutes old. Unmistakably, completely gray. Naomi said very quietly, "I told you." He couldn't speak. He tried. It didn't happen. "There's a chair," she said. "You should sit down." He sat down. He sat in that chair until 6 in the morning when a nurse came and suggested gently but clearly that he might want to get some rest. He went to the hallway. He sat in a plastic chair outside the room, and he put his elbows on his knees and he held his face in his hands, and he breathed. Marco arrived at 7:15. Not because Alessio had called him, he hadn't, but because Marco had been tracking the situation with the specific competence of a man who had spent 14 years making sure that whatever Alessio walked into, he didn't walk into alone. He sat down in the plastic chair next to Alessio, and he didn't say anything. After a while, Alessio said, "It's a boy." "I know," Marco said. "Carver called me." "Of course he did." A pause. Marco looked at his hands. "Reyes?" "It's handled." Alessio straightened in the chair. He was exhausted in a way he didn't have a prior reference for. Not operational exhaustion, not the kind that comes from sustained threat or extended work, but something deeper, something that had to do with the particular cost of being fully present for something real. The Eastern accounts, the Mason properties, the Cayman structure. Marco was quiet for a moment. "That's significant." "Yes. And you're okay with that?" Alessio looked at the door of the room where Naomi and Noah were sleeping. He looked at it for a moment. "Yes," he said. Marco nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, which was why Alessio had kept him around for 14 years. "Dario," Alessio said, "still being held, waiting on your instruction." "Let him go." Marco looked at him. Let him go," Alessio said again. "He's not a threat. He's a man who made a bad decision because he was scared for his brother." He paused. "Get information on the brother. Whatever Reyes was holding over him, I want it cleared. You want to clear Dario's brother's debt. I want the leverage gone so Dario can make actual choices." He said it flatly. "That's not mercy. That's just removing an instrument." He paused. "And it's done. I don't want to talk about it again." Marco nodded. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. "Marco," Alessio said. He turned. "Thank you. For the 14 years." Marco looked at him for a moment. His expression did something that was, for Marco, the equivalent of a long speech. "Get some rest," he said. "Boss?" He left. Naomi was awake when Alessio came back into the room at 9 in the morning. Noah was in the hospital bassinet, sleeping with the extravagant commitment of the very new. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle that makes hospital rooms look briefly human, and Naomi was sitting up in bed with her hair pulled back and a cup of something warm between her hands, and the specific exhausted clarity of a person who has come through something difficult and arrived at the other side still intact. She looked at him when he came in. "You stayed," she said. "In the hallway." "I know. The nurses told me." A pause. "Sit down." He sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at Noah in the bassinet. Still gray-eyed, even sleeping, even with his eyes closed, the specific architecture of his face had announced itself with total confidence within hours of his arrival. Naomi's mouth, the bridge of his nose, which would be Alessio's when it finished making itself. Both of their hands. "I need to ask you something," Naomi said. He looked at her. "The situation," she said. "Reyes. The accounts you gave up." She held the cup steadier. "Is it over? Or is this the part where I go back to looking over my shoulder?" "It's over," he said. "Reyes's word is specific. Whatever else he doesn't revise it once it's given. It's bad for business. And you believe that." "I've done business in proximity to Reyes for 6 years. I believe it." She looked at him for a moment, weighing it. She had the evaluating expression she'd always had when someone told her something important. Not distrustful, exactly, but thorough. She didn't accept things as a courtesy. She examined them. "Okay," she said, "just that." "Okay." I understood that she was not saying she believed him blindly. She was saying she had examined the claim and found it sufficiently credible to proceed. "What happens now?" she said. "To you." He looked at his hands. "The organization runs without me. Marco can manage the transition. Most of what I controlled is either going to Reyes or being wound down." He paused. "It was already becoming. It was getting harder to hold. It's been getting harder for 2 years and I didn't want to see it." "Why?" "Because letting go of something you built is..." He stopped. It requires admitting you built it for the wrong reasons, which requires knowing what the right reasons would have been. He looked up at her. I didn't know that for a long time. She looked at him steadily. And now? He looked at Noah. She followed his gaze. I'm not going to tell you it's simple, he said. I'm not going to tell you I'm a different person. I don't believe in that, and you wouldn't believe it anyway. He looked back at her. But I know what I want to protect now. I know the specific shape of it, and I know that the way I've been living does not produce that. So, she was quiet. So, she said. Yes. She looked down at the cup in her hands. She turned it slowly, a small rotation, both hands on it. He recognized this, the physical gesture she made when she was arriving at something, when her thoughts were getting organized into the order they needed to be in. I haven't forgiven you, she said. I know. I don't know if I will, or when, or what that looks like. She looked up. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because you've spent a lot of time assuming you know where things stand, and I need you to know exactly where this stands. I know where it stands, he said. Do you? Yes. He held her gaze. It stands where you put it. I understand that now. That's where it has to be. She looked at him for a long moment. Then Noah made a sound. Not crying, a smaller sound, an adjustment, the sound of a person shifting within their own existence. They both looked at him. He settled again. When Alessio looked back at Naomi, something in her face had changed by a small and significant degree. There's something I need to tell you, she said. He waited. The night I left, she said, I saw everything. I know what it looked like. I know what it was. She paused. But I want you to know that I knew before that night that something was wrong. Not about Vivian. About me. About us. She held the cup. I had been leaving for a long time before I actually left. You should know that, because it's not fair to put all of it on one night. He looked at her. You weren't honest with me about Vivian, she said, about what she still was to you. That's true, and that's not something I'm going to just absorb. But I also wasn't honest with you about how far I'd already gone, about the account, the planning. I was already halfway out, and you didn't know because I didn't tell you. She paused. I was protecting myself, which I had every right to do. But it means we both had secrets. He said nothing. I'm not saying it's equal, she said quickly. It's not. What I saw that night... She stopped. She breathed. That will probably always be the thing I see when I close my eyes at the wrong moment. That's just true. But I'm telling you this because if we're going to... She stopped again. If we're going to what? He said carefully. She looked at Noah for a moment. Be in the same place, she said finally. Whatever that means. Whatever it ends up meaning. I'm not talking about going back to what we had. That's gone. That specific thing is gone. She looked back at him. But whatever we build from this point forward, if we build anything, I need it to start from the truth. The whole truth. Both directions. He sat forward in the chair. He told her about Vivian. Not the version he'd been carrying, compressed and managed. The version he'd told himself. The real version. That Vivian had been the first person he'd loved when he was young enough to love without strategy, before this life had fully formed him, and that he had never, not even in his marriage, not even in his happiest moments with Naomi, entirely finished with her, not because he loved her more, but because he had never made the deliberate choice to let her go. She had remained, not as an active want, but as an unresolved thing. And unresolved things have a way of walking back through the door when you leave it unlocked for long enough. He told her that the night Vivian showed up, it had been 6 minutes, not more. That he had stepped back and that what had happened between them was less than what it had looked like. And also, and this was the part he'd never been able to say to anyone, still wrong, still a betrayal. Not because of the physical fact of it, but because he had allowed himself to stand in his own house and hold another woman's face and feel, for those 6 minutes, like a man who had not yet made the choices he'd made. He told her about the voicemail, the one about the doctor's appointment, the one that had come through 3 weeks before the night she left, the one he'd listened to 4 times in his car and then hadn't brought home with him because he hadn't known how to enter the house, already knowing that everything was about to change. He told her about the coffee, about making 2 cups every morning by muscle memory for 3 months. He said it the way people say things they've never said aloud before, awkwardly, at the wrong pace, in slightly the wrong order. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I know about the voicemail," she said. He looked at her. "I sent it on purpose," she said. "Not, it was real information. I was really telling you about the appointment. But I sent it in a way that let me pretend you might not hear it. So I didn't have to be in the room when you did." She paused. "Because I was afraid of your face." "My face?" "The way you would have looked," she said. "I was afraid it would be the complicated version. That you would be happy and also something else. That I would see both things at once and I wouldn't know what to do with it." She looked at her hands. "So I sent a voicemail instead of telling you to your face, and then I came home early to tell you in person. And the universe—" She stopped, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. "The universe had a lot of opinions about that." He looked at her. "I should have told you to your face," she said. "I should have said it at the kitchen table and made you sit with it in front of me, and I didn't, and that part is mine." She looked at Noah. "He deserves parents who can tell each other the truth in the same room." Alessio said, "Yes." She looked back at him. "Then that's where we start." Maya arrived at 11 in the morning with a bag of food from a diner 3 blocks away and an expression that suggested she had been awake since approximately the moment Naomi had texted her the previous morning, which was accurate. She was shorter than Naomi and louder than Naomi and had the quality of someone who processed everything through motion. She hugged her sister for a long time and then held Noah and then set him very carefully back and then looked at Alessio. The look lasted several seconds. He held it without flinching. He owed her that. She said, "You look terrible." "I've been told." "Good." She looked at Naomi. "I'm going to go get coffee from the machine down the hall. I'll be gone approximately 7 minutes. Naomi said, "Maya." "7 minutes," Maya said. She picked up her bag and she walked out without looking at Alessio again, which was its own kind of verdict. Not forgiveness, not even a door left open. Just the pragmatic acknowledgement that the person she loved most in the world was in this room and needed space to make her own choices. In the 7 minutes that followed, Alessio and Naomi sat in a hospital room with their son sleeping between them and the morning going about its business outside the window, and they didn't speak. It was a different silence from all the others. Not the silence of his empty house. Not the silence of the doorway the night everything broke. Not the silence of a hallway outside a room where someone you have failed is sleeping. This silence had weight and it had shape, and it was, he thought, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have said enough true things to each other that the air between them is changed. Not resolved, not healed, changed. Maya came back with 2 cups of bad coffee and handed one to Naomi and sat in the chair by the window, and nobody talked for a while. And it was, against all reasonable expectation, not uncomfortable. 3 days later, Naomi and Noah went home. Not to the mansion. There was never any discussion of the mansion. Naomi's apartment, the one she'd been building her life in, the one with the milk crate bookshelves and the window that someone had photographed them through, was not safe, and both of them knew it, and the question of where they would go had to be answered practically before it could be answered in any other way. Carver had her property. He offered it without being asked, which Alessio would later understand was Carver's particular way of settling debts, quietly, in advance, so the other person didn't have to ask. A house in a quieter part of the city, owned through a structure with no connection to anything Reyes or anyone else could trace. 2 bedrooms, a small yard. The kind of neighborhood where people noticed strangers but didn't comment on them to anyone outside the neighborhood. Alessio drove them there. He carried Noah's car seat and one of Naomi's bags from the hospital entrance to the car, and he did it with the careful attention of someone performing a task they have been given exactly one chance to do correctly. He did not try to take the second bag from Maya, who had it, and who gave him a look when he reached for it that clearly communicated she was not there yet, and he should respect that. He respected it. At the house, he helped bring things inside. He set up the portable crib that Maya had brought, following instructions that were printed in a font too small for his eyes in the bad light of the bedroom, saying nothing about it, trying 3 configurations before finding the right one. Naomi watched from the doorway. "The instructions," she said, "are on the back of the bag." He looked at the bag. He found the instructions. They were considerably clearer. She made a small sound behind him that he was almost certain was a suppressed laugh, and then he heard her walk away down the hall. When the crib was assembled correctly, he checked it twice, 3 times. He came into the small living room. Maya was in the kitchen making noise with things in bags. Noah was in Naomi's arms on the couch, and Naomi was looking at him the way she'd been looking at him since the hospital, with a totality of attention that was different from anything Alessio had seen directed at himself in his entire life, because it wasn't complicated, it wasn't measured, it was just complete. Alessio stood in the entrance to the living room. Naomi looked up. "There's a chair," she said, nodding to the armchair across from the couch. The same thing she'd said in the hospital. "Sit down, don't hover, be in the room." He sat down. They sat in the living room of a borrowed house while Maya made food in the kitchen, and Noah slept with the untroubled totality of someone who has no concept of what has happened to bring him to this specific room, this specific afternoon, these specific people who had managed to find each other through a damage neither of them was fully done accounting for. After a while, Naomi said, "There are going to be rules." "Okay." "I'm serious, actual rules, written down if I decide I want them written down." "Okay," he said again. "No disappearing," she said. "If something is happening, you tell me. I don't care what it is or how operational it is or whether you think I can handle it. You tell me." "Yes." "And you don't make decisions for me about what I need or what's safe or what I should know. You can offer information, you can have opinions, but you don't decide." "Yes." She looked at him. "You're agreeing very quickly." "Because I agree." "Alessio." She said his name the way she had in the beginning, all of it, not a shortening, not a gesture toward it. "I've watched you agree to things before and then do something else entirely when you thought you knew better." He held her gaze. "I know." So I'm telling you that I know, and that I'm going to get it wrong, and that when I get it wrong, I'd rather you tell me directly than disappear again. He said the last part without accusation, just as fact, as something he was asking to be different in the future. "If I do something wrong, tell me. In the room. Not by leaving." She was quiet for a moment. "That goes both directions," she said. "Yes." Another pause. Longer. Noah made a small sound and she adjusted her hold on him without looking down, the specific automatic competence of someone who has already been doing this for 3 days and has begun to develop the fluency. "I'm not in love with you the same way I was," she said. "Not cruel, just accurate. I don't know if that comes back. I don't know what I feel right now, honestly, because the last 24 hours have been—" She stopped. "But I know that you were in that room. I know that when it mattered you were there, and you stayed, and you didn't try to make it about yourself." She looked at him. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's also not everything." "I know." "But it's somewhere to be," she said. "It's a place to stand while we figure out what the rest of it looks like." He looked at his son, at the small weight of him in Naomi's arms, the absolute unawareness of him, the trust built into the very structure of how he held his body, relaxed, open, entirely undefended, the way humans come into the world before the world teaches them otherwise. He thought about how long it would take, and what it would cost, and what kind of man he would need to become, to be worth that trust. He thought, it doesn't matter. Whatever it costs, it doesn't matter. He said none of this aloud. Some things, he was learning, were better held. Not hidden, held. There was a difference. Hidden things rot. Held things wait for the right moment, and then they are said simply, without ceremony, to the right person, in a room where the light is ordinary and someone is making food in the next room and a new person is sleeping in your arms. He would say them then, not today. Today was too much and too recent and too careful for anything more than what they'd already managed. But eventually, when the ground was steadier, when she was ready to hear it and he had earned the right to say it. Maya came out of the kitchen carrying 2 bowls of something that smelled like the specific comfort of a person who cooks for people she loves when she doesn't know what else to do. She set one on the coffee table in front of Naomi and then stood with the second one and looked at Alessio. A long look. Then she went back to the kitchen and came out with a 3rd bowl and set it on the side table next to his chair. She sat on the other end of the couch from Naomi and picked up her own bowl and said, to no one in particular, "It needs more salt." Naomi tasted hers. "It's fine." "It needs more salt," Maya said firmly. I know my own cooking. Naomi looked at Alessio. The look had something in it, not quite a smile. The edge of one. The memory of how smiling felt, testing whether it still fit. He looked back at her. The house was warm. Outside, the afternoon was doing what afternoons do in winter, moving toward dark at a pace that feels too fast until you stop fighting it, until you decide to let the dark arrive and trust that the morning comes after. Noah slept. Naomi ate. Maya talked about the salt for longer than the salt warranted, and eventually Naomi told her to let it go, and Maya said she was just saying, and Naomi said she knew, and the argument about the salt lasted 3 more exchanges and then dissolved into the general quiet of the room. Alessio ate. He ate the food Maya had made without being asked to, in a chair in a borrowed house, and he looked at his wife and his son, and the empire he had built from damage and pride, and the wrong understanding of what was worth protecting existed somewhere behind him, getting smaller with every breath he took in this direction, and he did not look back at it. He had spent 20 years building walls. It turned out the hardest thing he would ever do was sit in a warm room with ordinary people eating food that needed more salt, and let himself be without armor, exactly where he was. No plan, no exit, no contingency. Just this. Just the specific and irreplaceable weight of a life that still had room in it for him, if he could learn, slowly, imperfectly, with full knowledge of his own history, to finally, genuinely let himself in.